Hi everyone, welcome back and welcome to part 2 of today's marathon conference, where we're turning from digital consumer protection to digital competition, and in particular the Digital Markets Act, where the Commission is currently in the process of undergoing a review of the implementation of the law, which is going to be raising questions around enforcement and potential future changes. And again, this is an area where we at CERRE are absolutely dedicated to contributing to the public discussion. We've got 2 papers that we will be discussing in this upcoming section, which deal with different aspects of this review. The first is on horizontal interoperability, which is the way that instant messaging services or potentially social networks will be able to talk to each other. And we've got a paper that has been published by Jan Kramer and Marc Bourreau, which covers that topic. And the second is on how the Commission should go about this task of assessing and potentially improving, hopefully improving, the DMA's impacts, which has been written by Richard Feasey, Giorgio Monti, and Alexandra Destriel. So I'm going to turn now to some short presentations by academics on each of these papers. We'll turn firstly to Richard, who'll be talking about assessing and improving the DMA impacts. Over to you, Richard.
So, thanks, Zach. So, as Zach says, I'm going to talk briefly about the paper we wrote, which you all have access to now, on assessing the impact of the DMA and how to think about that, written in conjunction with Alex and Giorgio. As you all know, the DMA in Article 53 has a sort of rather general requirement for the Commission to periodically assess the impact of the DMA. And it draws a distinction between in the DMA, obviously, between assessing the impact and assessing compliance with, and I'll perhaps come back to that. The Commission needs to do that by May of this year as their first review, and then there's a sort of cycle every 3 years. So it's within that context that we are making some suggestions about how the Commission, in the longer term, I think it's too late now for the first May review process, how in the longer term it might think about this in more detail. As I say, the DMA itself the article doesn't really give very much guidance, but in our view it's important that the Commission is, and everybody else, is clear about what is the purpose of the review. It sounds very nice, thinking about the impact, but what are we actually trying to achieve and inform by doing this? And then, in addition, obviously, how do we go about, in practical terms, about undertaking that task? We're starting, we think, with a pretty blank sheet of paper, so there's lots of sort of anecdotal, we would describe it as, evidence at the moment. If you ask gatekeepers to self-assess their compliance, as they're required to do every year, then obviously you get some information selectively from the gatekeepers as to their views on impact. But as I'll come back to, at the moment, there's no kind of standardized format or mandated requirements in terms of how they present that sort of information. And then outside of that, we are still, and we recognize this very explicitly in the paper, in the compliance, the early stages, or perhaps the middle now, of the initial sort of compliance process. And you have to get a certain way along that path, really, before it makes sense for people to start thinking about assessing impact. So there's not a lot of information, we think. There are a number of studies with very large numbers and very large ranges, but by and large, there's not very much useful information, certainly in the public domain at the moment, that we might use. Fortunately, we have some time, so again, our eyes are very much set on 3 years hence being well placed and in the position to do a more comprehensive impact assessment at that point. And it takes time for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, is this iterative process of compliance. We don't all just get there at one point in time. CERRE has said this now for many years, and it's, I think, now apparent to everyone that we're on a process here. And secondly, even if you get to a certain point in terms of the gatekeeper's conduct, the reactions of end users and of business users to changes in gatekeeper behavior or other actions that the gatekeeper take, the impact of those reactions in itself takes time to filter through. So there are a lot of sort of inherited behaviors and default effects in the way that particularly end users engage with digital markets at the moment, which when they're presented with new opportunities and new choices, actually take time for end users to change their learned behaviors, which we've all developed over the last 15, 20 years or so. So observing the impacts and understanding the impacts of compliance and actions that gatekeepers take is something also that's going to take time. Now, having said that, we do not, there is a view, just to be clear, that says, well, we should wait until we get to some sort of end state of compliance before we can start talking about impact. We don't see it like that. We see this as an interdependent relationship. We can get on with thinking and understanding the impacts, even if we're not at some end state of full compliance. Were we to ever, in fact, arrive at that destination. So the first thing and the first recommendation we make is, because we don't have any data, meaningful data in the public domain really to enable us to embark on this exercise, is that we have to make that happen. For very understandable reasons, neither gatekeepers nor actually business users nor anybody else has incentives to volunteer the data that you need. They will volunteer data that's clearly helpful to whatever case they intend to make. But we need some kind of mandatory obligations, reporting obligations, to be put in place, which don't exist at the moment. And we've written another paper on output indicators that some of you will no doubt be familiar, which talks in more detail about what data ought to be required, primarily from the gatekeepers, because by virtue of their market position and their gatekeeper position, they have a visibility across of the consequences and impact of their actions that really no other firm is going to have, but potentially also from other data sources, from business users and others, to populate a framework. Now, the final point on this is no one knows in advance what the outcome or what conclusions you will draw from this kind of evidence-based, data-driven impact assessment. So it creates risks for the Commission, because the answer may be, or the conclusions may be, some of the measures that have been taken don't actually yield substantive benefits or actually may produce significant harms. But also clearly for gatekeepers and for other market participants. But it sort of requires a collective commitment at the beginning of the process that we will be judged by the data. There's no point collecting data if you don't know what sort of framework you're going to organize it within. So the next part of the paper is a very much a first cut, I would say, of the sorts of headings and the sorts of areas that you would look at in devising a framework to assess both the benefits and the costs, so the positives and the negatives. And we see this very much not in terms of the DMA as some sort of generic overall undertaking, but very specific to specific obligations as applied to particular specific core platform services. Okay, so it's very granular. It's not high-level numbers of billions of euros of R&D or whatever it may be. It's for this specific measure, applied to this specific core platform service, how do we think about the costs and the benefits? And you can read this for yourself, and they're explained in the paper given time, but clearly on the benefits side there are competition effects, both in terms of the related markets that depend on the core platform service, and in terms of direct competitors, potentially at least, with the gatekeeper, competing with the gatekeeper themselves. There are transaction savings, cost savings, in terms of switching costs, in terms of consumers' terms of trade, if you like, end users' terms of trade with the gatekeepers and privacy. On the cost side, we've seen a lot of emphasis so far on gatekeeper compliance costs. That's a relevant consideration. It's difficult. We need to distinguish between, as it were, legitimately incurred costs and costs that might be incurred for particular commercial or strategic purposes that are not strictly necessary for compliance. There are innovation losses potentially if services are delayed in terms of introduction into the European market or not developed at all. There are differentiation quality effects. I'll come back to differentiation in a second. There are consequences for business users having to engage in a more potentially competitive but also fragmented market, potentially with different standards, and so on. So this framework needs developing, but the Commission has, we think, 3 years essentially to build out a proper analytical framework to work out the data required to populate it, with consultation with the affected, interested parties. So everybody commits to some kind of framework that allows you to, in a quantitative way, begin to really understand the impact of the DMA. Last slide. So some of this work arose in the context of discussions with various gatekeepers and also business users and others. And this slide really is a number of other sort of related points that arose, particularly around thinking about implementation of the DMA going forward. So one issue here is where you have, for example, core platform services that are competing with each other. You may have, and clearly the example we have in mind here is mobile operating systems at the moment. You may have different groups of customers, different groups of end users at the moment, hosted on different platforms. Okay, so it's a dangerous assumption when thinking about the impact or measuring the impact of the DMA to assume that customers are evenly distributed and customer preferences are the same across different platforms. And the reason why that matters is because the impact of the DMA and the measures that, even if two gatekeepers take the same measures, if they have differentiated customers, different groups of customers who respond to those measures in different ways, you will see different impacts. So in earlier writings, I in particular, but others had thought, benchmarking between gatekeepers running the same CPS is a way of thinking about compliance. Doesn't mean that you assume that they have to be the same, but it's a way of at least getting some kind of benchmarks in this whole exercise. But actually, because of this heterogeneity of users on the different platforms, we now think that sort of benchmarking process needs to be approached with caution. As a more general point, we also think just this differentiation in products and services is a valuable feature of markets that are responsive to this differentiation of end user preferences. So we need to be careful when we're thinking about intervening in markets to try and preserve that if we can. Next point is everybody complains about uncertainty in terms of the measures to be taken. Our view is we're in a sort of funnel where there's a higher degree of uncertainty at the outset, but that we ought to, and the Commission through comfort letters and various other delegated acts and so on, ought to be providing increased certainty over time and that should be a particular objective of the Commission. So we understand why there was a high degree of uncertainty at the outset, but that should diminish over time. And then lastly, we've got, and again, in the interest of time, it's in the paper, there are internal tensions between various obligations in the DMA, which means that compliance by a gatekeeper measures that are taken are often pulling in opposite directions. And that's unhelpful. You really want all the measures to be pointing at the same objective, at the same model of competition, for example. So over time and with experience, the Commission needs to sort out these inconsistencies. If you do all of that last point, and you apply a framework that allows you to understand impacts, you can begin to take a more surgical approach to which bits of the DMA are working and where benefits clearly outweigh costs, which bits may not be working as anticipated or at all, and filter and prioritize accordingly so that we end up with a more proportionate, less kind of one-size-fits-all approach to the implementation of the DMA. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. I'll now invite Marc Bourreau to come on the stage and talk to us about his paper on horizontal interoperability.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Zach. Good afternoon, everyone. No, I think it's the afternoon. Okay, so this is an issue paper that is jointly written with my colleague Jan Kremer from CERRE, and it deals with the opportunity to extend the interoperability obligation that exists in the DMA for messaging services to social networks. So this is in the context of the review of the DMA, where there is this question that has arisen about whether there should be an extension of interoperability obligation that is in Article 7 of the DMA for messaging services to social networks. And in this issue paper, we investigate this question using the following approach. So we analyze the opportunity to make this extension in light of the experience that we've had so far with interoperability of messaging services that is already being implemented, and our previous research at CERRE with Jan to assess what could be the potential benefits and the potential challenges of implementing interoperability for social networks. And then based on this analysis, we make some recommendations. So let me start with the potential benefits of implementing interoperability for social networks. So the main idea is that we face a market that is highly concentrated with a few dominant players, a few social networks that are quite dominating. And this domination of this market domination of these players is due to the strong network effects that are at play, and for which their large install bases constitute important advantages. So as a remedy to this situation where, because of this strong concentration, we may have concern about the level of competition in the market, there is a potential remedy that is envisaged, which is the possibility to mandate interoperability of social networks. And here, what is the idea? The idea is that we start from a situation where network effects are at the firm level, they are firm specific, and by introducing interoperability across these social networks, we kind of aggregate the firm specific social network effects into industry-wide network effects. And as a result, when firms compete, these network effects no longer play a role because they are shared between the firms, and then firms are pushed to compete on other dimensions like the quality of service, the innovativeness of their features, or the level of privacy that they provide to their users. So this is the idea, and there is an analogy with telecoms, where interconnection, which was the word for interoperability at the time, was introduced and allowed competition in the market to develop. So let me now turn to the potential challenges of interoperability for social network. The first kind of challenge that we have in mind is the fact that the pro-competitive benefits that I've just discussed associated with interoperability are probably limited, and this is for the following reasons. The first reason is that when we implement interoperability for complex and proprietary services like social network or messaging services, interoperability can be implemented only for a subset of features, leaving other features outside of the scope of interoperability. So contrary to telecoms, where all features are interoperable. And as a result, some network effects remain at play, and the large players that dominate through network effects will probably remain dominant, because then consumers may have an incentive to use the largest networks, the largest social networks, as an access point to communicate and interact with their friends and family. The second reason is that interoperability can reduce the incentives of users to multi-home. And we view multi-homing as a strong driver for contestability in the market for social network or messaging services. And by reducing multi-homing, we think that there could be situations where, contrary to what we would expect and want to implement, contestability would be actually reduced. The second kind of challenges that we have in mind relate more specifically to implementation. First, implementation is going to be complex, and enforcement is going to be complicated as well. So the experience of messaging services so far has proved that making it work is complicated. So far there are only two very small players that ask for interoperability with Meta, and it's not functional yet. So we think that for social network it will be an order of magnitude of complexity much larger than for messenger services, and so these implementation challenges are going to show up as well. The second challenge is that there are some unavoidable compromises, we think, with regards to privacy or security. For security, when you have more actors involved, as it will be the case with interoperability, there are higher risks as well. And for privacy, when you want interoperability to work, some data about users should be handled and shared across different players. And this would also intensify privacy risks. And finally, in the specific context of social networks, so we are all aware, and this was discussed, for example, this morning, of the kind of societal problems associated with social networks, like disinformation, hateful speech, addictive usage patterns. And we think that by facilitating cross-platform diffusion of messages and information, actually interoperability could, in a way, exacerbate to some extent these problems. So it's not for sure, but at least it's a concern that we should have. So at the end of the day, we believe that extending the scope of Article 7 to social networks is not likely to bring substantial pro-competitive benefits, while at the same time it may raise important problems with regards to the implementation, security, and societal risks. So we think that the returns to this policy, to these extensions, are rather limited, and there is an opportunity cost of collective action and public policy, and probably so this extension should not be conducted. This is our conclusion. Thank you.